Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and still I rise. I rise today, as I always do, with great respect for all and love of country at heart. I rise today for very special reasons. Today is one of the days that I will cherish for the rest of my life. And what I will do today is something that I believe will help us to commemorate an unfortunate circumstance that our country has been a part of. This is a day that I will have the opportunity to bring to the attention of the Congress of the United States of America a very special resolution. This is a resolution that is supporting the designation of Slavery Remembrance Day. The resolution proposes that August the 20th, 2021 serve as the first Slavery Remembrance Day. And this is done to remind us of the evils of slavery. I have noticed that as time has passed during my lifetime, that there have been those who have sought to whitewash, to sanitize the evils associated with slavery. This is a necessary resolution because this resolution will forever allow us to remember the horrors of slavery, the events that have shaped our current circumstances. Slavery was our seminal sin. It's the sin that has, for too long, centuries, for too long, had an impact on the politics, the economics, the social standing of people in our country. This resolution reads as follows. I shall not read it in its entirety today, but there are some portions of it that are exceedingly important. It reads, whereas this resolution may be cited as the original Slavery Remembrance Day resolution of 2021. And for those who keep records, it is HRes 517. HRes 517. It has been filed, and it has more than 75 original co-sponsors. I'm saying original and more than 75 simply because right up to the last minute we were adding people. So more than 75 original co-sponsors. I shall do all that I can to memorialize the persons who are original co-sponsors, and I shall seek additional co-sponsors of this resolution. Whereas the House of Representatives recognizes August 20th, 2021 as Slavery Remembrance Day and commemorates the lives of all enslaved people, while also condemning the act and perpetuation of slavery in the United States of America and across the world. Whereas we posthumously recognize the following members of Congress who served during and after the Reconstruction era as honorary co-sponsors of this resolution. Their names are listed. I will not read them today. I want to do something very special when these names are mentioned, and they shall be mentioned in the near future. But their names are all here. Persons who actually served in the Congress of the United States of America. These are persons who merit a special place in history because of all that they had to endure to serve our country. Whereas on August 20th, 1619, the first 20 enslaved Africans were brought to what is now Fort Monroe, then Point Comfort. At that time, the time that they arrived, August 20th, 1619, it was Point Comfort. History has a way of reminding us of things. Point Comfort, the place where 20 enslaved Africans arrived. Point Comfort. Whereas the House of Representatives recognizes August 20th, 2021 as Slavery Remembrance Day and commemorates the lives of all enslaved people, while also condemning the act and perpetuation of slavery in the United States of America and across the world. Whereas tribal chiefs captured, enslaved, and sold their captives to transatlantic slave traders. You can't tell the story without telling the whole story. You have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. If there is a scintilla of a mistake in what I say, I would beg that people would contact me and let me know, because the truth about slavery must be told. And the truth is that African people sold other Africans into slavery. Whereas over the period of the Atlantic slave trade, from approximately 1526 to 1867, millions of humans were abducted and shipped from Africa, and 10,700,000 arrived in the Americas as personal property. Whereas the majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. I do want to emphasize the fact that they were personal property, chattels. They could be bought, they could be sold. I do understand that this is a part of the history that we don't cherish. It's a part of the history that we don't care to recall, but it's a part of the history that we must remember. We cannot allow ourselves to think for any amount of time that history will never repeat itself. And we have to be ever vigilant so as to prevent history from repeating itself. This is why we must have a Remembrance Day. This is not the only Remembrance Day, my dear friends. We remember 9/11, and it is commemorated for the lives that were lost. We remember Pearl Harbor. We remember January 6th, the date of the insurrection. And my prognostication is that there will be a January 6th Remembrance Day. Days such as these, days that are infamous, should always be remembered in the annals of history, and they should forever live in infamy. But we have to remember these days. Whereas 6% of African captives were sent directly to British North America, whereas by 1825 the population of the United States included 1/4 of the people of African descent in what has been called the New World. Whereas the Middle Passage from West Africa to the West Indies was dangerous and horrific for enslaved people. Whereas the Middle Passage carried mothers, fathers, children, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, and individuals from all walks of life to slavery in the Americas. Whereas although the sexes were separated, men, women, and children were kept naked, packed, and even stacked, I might add, but packed close together. And the men were chained for long periods. Whereas according to some historians, about 12% of those who embarked did not survive the voyage. Whereas sharks followed the slave ships to feed on the bodies of slaves thrown overboard. Whereas enslaved people suffered a variety of miserable and often fatal maladies due to the Atlantic slave trade and the inhumane living and working conditions. Whereas infant and child mortality rates were twice as high among slave children as among Southern white children. Whereas enslaved people often worked from sunup to after sundown, 6 to 7 days a week, often without food for long periods of time. Whereas enslaved black families lived with the perpetual possibility of separation caused by the sale of one or more family members. Stepping aside from the text for a moment, it has to be painful to hear this, to know that on the auction block, a mother could be separated from her children. To know that on that auction block, families would be separated and could be sent in different directions. Human beings treated as property. The suffering that they endured is unthinkable, unimaginable. Suffering that not even the mind of Dante could imagine. Persons treated to a certain extent like animals, human beings, enslaved black families. Continuing with the text. Whereas it is estimated that approximately 1/3 of enslaved children in the upper South states of Maryland and Virginia experienced family separation in one of 3 possible scenarios: sale away from parents, S-A-L-E, sale with mother away from father, or sale of mother or father away from children. These are the horrors of slavery, the evils of slavery that we can never, ever forget. Just as we never forget other horrors, just as we have remembrance days for them, we should have this remembrance day for slavery. Continuing with the text. Whereas Nat Turner was born into slavery in Southampton County, Virginia in 1800. Whereas Southampton County was home to many plantations and enslaved people outnumbered free whites. Whereas Turner learned to read and write at an early age, a young age, becoming deeply religious. Whereas Turner was sold to several different masters over the course of his life, the last time in 1830. Whereas Turner preached to his fellow enslaved people, developing a loyal following. Whereas Turner began planning a revolt with a few trusted fellow enslaved men from neighboring plantations. Generally speaking, we honor people who fight being held in captivity. Generally speaking, they are held in high esteem. They are celebrated for their desire to be free and their willingness to fight for their freedom. Generally speaking. But one has to ask, where are all of the statues for Nat Turner? Where are all of the resolutions that have been written extolling the virtues of Nat Turner? The question must be posed: how can we honor those who enslaved to a greater extent than we honor those who suffered the horrors of slavery? Whereas, continuing with the text, Turner began planning a revolt with a few trusted fellow enslaved men from neighboring plantations. Whereas Turner's rebellion began in August 1831, quickly growing from a small handful of enslaved individuals to more than 70 enslaved and free blacks. Whereas the rebellions went from house to house in Southampton County, freeing enslaved people, whereas the rebels were ultimately defeated by a state militia that had over twice the manpower of the rebels, with 3 artillery companies reinforcing it. Whereas Turner was captured 6 weeks after the rebellion was put down, whereupon he was quickly convicted and sentenced to death. Continuing with the text. Whereas in retaliation for the uprising, Virginia officially executed 56 black people, with at least 100 more killed by militias through extrajudicial violence. We're now talking about people who were killed because other people fought for their freedom. Stepping aside from the text, we can never allow ourselves to sanitize the horrors of slavery. This resolution is important. There has to be a day of remembrance. Whereas the rebellion caused widespread panic among slaveholders throughout the South, resulting in widespread violence against enslaved people. Please understand, I take no great pride in reading this, in presenting this. There's no great pride in this. There's pain. This is sinful and shameful. And we can never forget the horrors of slavery. Whereas, in the wake of the rebellion, the Virginia General Assembly passed legislation making it illegal to teach enslaved free blacks to read and write. I take no pleasure. Whereas the Underground Railroad was a network of individuals who helped around 100,000 slaves escaped to the north. Whereas the railroad began when a conductor, often posing as a slave, would enter a plantation and attempt to guide runaways. Whereas the escapees would travel 10 to 20 miles each night between safe houses or stations to avoid detection, waiting in safe houses for the next along the line to be alerted to their presence. Whereas Miss Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery along the Underground Railroad. A network of abolitionists who guided escaped slaves to the north, traveling primarily at night to avoid bounty hunters. Many of these persons, my dear friends, my dear brothers and sisters, were not of African ancestry. We didn't get here by ourselves. There were people of goodwill, of many stripes, that made it possible for us to have these opportunities that we have today. I thank them all. My prayer is that there will always be such people of goodwill to assist those who find themselves in harm's way due to injustice. Continuing with the text. Whereas Miss Tubman returned to the South no less than 13 times to free 70 enslaved persons, including much of her family, for which she would be given the name Moses. Whereas Miss Tubman deftly led those she saved north during the fall and winter, when there would be captors stayed inside to avoid the cold. Some things bear repeating. Whereas Miss Tubman deftly led those she saved north during the fall and winter, when their would-be captors stayed inside to avoid the cold. Whereas Miss Tubman's own words, I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. Whereas during the Civil War, Miss Tubman served as a nurse, scout, spy in the Union Army, becoming the first woman to plan and lead a military operation in the United States, liberating 700 enslaved people in South Carolina. Excuse me. Whereas the life of Miss Tubman continued, working to improve the lives of oppressed people, raising funds and building schools, as well as hospitals, in the name of formerly enslaved people, while participating in the women's suffrage movement. Whereas John Brown, an abolitionist who ran an important stop on the Underground Railroad, dedicated his life to slavery. Whereas John Brown led a militia to end guerrilla attacks on pro-slavery towns in Kansas, losing one of his sons in the struggle. Whereas John Brown, with the help of Harriet Tubman, planned and organized an invasion of the South to free all slaves. One has to ask, where are the statues of John Brown? One has to ask, how is it that we have statues within a short distance of where I stand now, honoring those who would enslave, but not honoring those who would set the slaves free? One has to ask, how do these things happen? But one has to also be appreciative of the fact that their removal is almost a certainty now. One has to be appreciative of the fact that there are those among us who have taken up the fight for freedom, and they brought it to the very floor of this House of Representatives. I'm grateful to those who have concluded that we must remove the statues of those who would enslave. And my prayer is, we will replace them with some statues of those who fought to free the slaves. This is my prayer. Continuing with the text. Whereas Brown began his invasion at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, but was surrounded and captured by federal troops led by Robert E. Lee, losing 2 more sons in the fighting. There are still people alive today who don't want John Brown to be celebrated. They don't want the people who gave their very last breath, the very last ounce of their existence to the cause of freedom. Celebrate those who would enslave, but not those who would free the slaves. I'm grateful to those people of goodwill who stand today to continue the struggle for liberty and justice for all, as extolled in the Pledge of Allegiance. Whereas the 13th Amendment was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified on December 6, 1866. 65, and provides that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a condition of punishment, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. There's much more that can be said about the 13th Amendment. I beg that because I do not say it at this time, that you not charge me for not knowing some of the things that can be said about the 13th Amendment. Continuing with the text, whereas beginning in the 20th century, African Americans began to relocate from southern farms to southern cities, from the south to the northeast, midwest, and west, in a movement known as the Great Migration. Whereas the relocation of formerly enslaved individuals and their descendants also included unfavorable and at times unjust interactions with law enforcement that often resulted in imprisonment and convict leasing. Stepping aside from the text, in Sugar Land, Texas, bodies were unearthed. In Sugar Land, Texas, 95 bodies unearthed. Those who study these things have concluded that they were likely the victims of convict leasing. Convict leasing was a means by which slavery was continued by another name. Convict leasing allowed laws to be used to have persons who committed petty offenses held in jail. They were detained, couldn't pay a fine. These black codes, as they were called, allowed for convict leasing to continue. Persons were arrested for just standing around, not having a job, put into the convict leasing program. 95 such bodies were found of persons who are thought to have been victims of convict leasing in Sugar Land, Texas, just outside of my congressional district, I might add. Whereas convict leasing, also known as slavery by another name, was a system that allowed persons to lease imprisoned individuals to private entities, often corporations and plantations. Whereas the remains of 95 persons thought to be of African ancestry who were subjected to the state of Texas convict leasing system were discovered in 2018 at the construction site of Fort Bend Independent School District's James Reese Career and Technical Center in Sugar Land, Texas. There's much more to be said about this. In the days, weeks to come, I shall say more about this and what has happened to these 95 persons. Human beings buried to a certain extent in a common grave area. Whereas, while slavery was abolished, the descendants of the enslaved continued to live with the effects of slavery's progenies. These progenies, Jim Crow, mass lynchings, segregation, police brutality, mass incarceration, and institutionalized racism. Progenies of slavery. Stepping aside from the text, I am a son of the segregated South. I've experienced these progenies, some of them, not all, of course. I'm 73 years of age. I have been blessed to live longer than many thought I would. Not because of some illness, but because I was born black. The prognosticators never projected nor prognosticated that I'd be standing here. There's nothing at my birth that would have given anyone reason to believe that I would stand here. And probably there was nothing that would give persons reason to believe that I would stand here and read this resolution. For many, this is a resolution that's not supposed to be filed. It's not supposed to be heard. I'm a liberated Democrat. I'm not going to allow my agenda, the agenda of those who have suffered, to go unnoticed. It won't happen on my watch. As long as I'm in this house, I'm going to remind us that we have a duty and a responsibility as well as an obligation to understand the evils of slavery and understand how they have not evaporated. They've not simply faded away. To this day, the progenies of the evils still haunt us. They haunt us. They haunt us in this very house. And for those who are offended, I beg that you would forgive me. But I don't have any recourse. Those who sent me here, they didn't send me here to do all that I can to get along and go along. They sent me here to try to make a difference. I guess I have a case of the can't help it's. I do what I have to because I know my history and I've suffered the pain from a progeny of slavery. Continuing with the text. Whereas, despite the horrors of slavery and against all odds, enslaved people became thought leaders and revolutionaries and changed the course of American history. Too often they are forgotten, pushed aside. Too often the history that they made is stolen. Too often the status quo will wait until they can find a proper person to attribute the history to. The status quo too often selects the persons that ought to be celebrated in history. And too often those persons are not the persons who suffered to bring the history to a better place. The status quo has many ways to defend itself. The status quo can do it with the power of appointment. The status quo can do it with acknowledging people and ignoring others. Status quo has many ways to defend itself. I'm reminded of the words of Voltaire. He reminds us that it is dangerous to be, and I'm paraphrasing, it is dangerous to be right in matters where the established powers are wrong. Voltaire. So the status quo defends itself, and the true history is not always known. There will come a time, however, when the truth about some of the history I'm aware of will be made known. Mr. Chairman, the House is not in order. Someone appears to be on the phone in the House. I ask that we kindly investigate. This is a matter of serious concern, and a person ought not be on the phone in the House. It's contrary to the rules of the House. Person ought not do this when a serious matter is being discussed on the floor of the House of Representatives. Doesn't matter who that person is, by the way. And if the person doesn't stop, I'll put the person's name in the record because I know who it is. I'm not going to suffer that kind of disrespect. Resolved. This resolution may be cited as the original Slavery Remembrance Day resolution of 2021. That's section 1 in the short title. Section 2, Slavery Remembrance Day, that the House of Representatives, 1, supports the designation of a Slavery Remembrance Day to serve as a reminder of the evils of slavery. 2, condemns slavery and its evil progenies and encourages all to acknowledge the importance of slavery remembrance. I'm grateful to the Speaker for allowing the time. I'm grateful to the Majority Leader. I'm grateful to the Whip. I'm grateful to all of the chairs. I'm grateful to the many persons who are co-sponsors of this resolution. As I indicated, it was coming to me as I was moving to the floor, and I have found a note from my staff. I'm eternally grateful to my staff. 77 co-sponsors. 77. These are the persons who are part of what I believe to be a historic resolution. Those who are not should not be condemned. We simply but only ask that they would become co-sponsors, and this can be accomplished quite easily. Contact my office and let us know that you'd like to be a co-sponsor. The love we have for you is not diminished one scintilla because you're not an original. It is not. I'm not that kind of guy. I'm interested in having persons of goodwill become a part of this resolution. And there is much more that will be said and done as we move forward with the resolution. I thank all of the persons who are here today. I appreciate the fact that this House functions as efficaciously as it does. I'm going to remember who was standing with the gavel at hand. I'm going to remember the faces. This is a special moment in time. I'll remember those who were to speak after me. I'll remember this wonderful lady who's seated over to my left, who's always been so kind and so generous and gentle. I'll remember the person who has prevented me from talking on the phone and who doesn't allow it to happen in this house when there's business before this house. She's even-handed. She treats all of us the same. I'll remember the parliamentarian who has allowed his COVID beard to continue. That's just a joke, friends. I want to bring a bit of levity. But the parliamentarian has been very helpful, and all of those who are associated with the office, been very helpful. And I pray that on the 20th or before, this resolution will receive a vote in this House so that this House can go on record, as it has gone on record for many other things, as supporting Slavery Remembrance Day. Mr. Speaker, it's my honor now to yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.